My name is Stephanie Bunn and I am a lecturer in the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of St Andrews. In particular today, what we're all interested in and what we've come here to discuss is the role of basketry in occupational therapy. And this links in with the way it was used also in England at Seale-Hayne. One of the areas we've been looking at in Scotland is its use in Old Mill Hospital in the First World War, which is now Wood End Hospital. So we've got Tim Palmer here, who used to be a consultant pathologist at Regmore Hospital and is also a very excellent practising basket maker and is currently putting into practice by doing work with people in Regmore who're suffering from different kinds of brain injury. We also have Catherine Patterson here, who founded the Department of Occupational Therapy at Robert Gordon University, and Catherine's been a great source of inspiration. Well, Catherine, it's a great pleasure to have you here today with all your experience in occupational therapy. And I wonder if we could start the whole discussion by you telling us what is meant by the term occupational therapy.
Well, occupational therapy, the very first definition, was coined in 1922 by a physician in the United States called Patterson. And it was the same definition I learned in 1960, the first week I was an occupational therapy student in Edinburgh. And the definition is, occupational therapy is any activity, whether mental or physical, definitely prescribed for the distinct purpose of hastening recovery from disease or injury.
So if we could go on to the next question, which is, what are the origins of occupational therapy and when did it develop?
Well, if we talk about the origins of occupation being used therapeutically, it goes back a very long way in history. But specifically, if we look at moral treatment in psychiatry in basically the 19th century, as practiced by Philippe Pinel in Paris, by Tuke at the York Retreat, and our local one in Scotland is W.F. Brown, who worked at the Crichton Royal in Dumfries. And they all saw occupation as central to the treatment of people who were in asylums, places of security at that time, in a way of normalising life within the institution. A second way of looking at the origins of therapeutic use of occupation was in sanitoria. Tuberculosis, of course, was a huge problem, and the only way of treating it was in good surroundings with good food and in the initial stages, the febrile stages, of bed rest. And then the rehabilitation of the patient started with grading activities, and basketry would be one of the activities used in bed, which could be graded from very light over a short period of time and increasingly made more complex and involving the patient in more activity.
So what impact did World War I have on the development of curative workshops?
Well, I'm sorry to say that it had very little impact in Britain, but the important development was in North America. They, of course, had their own injured servicemen who went back home to Canada and the States, and they took the concept of the curative workshops with them. Of course, the curative workshops, the hospitals where the curative workshops were mainly staffed by American orthopaedic surgeons. So the first course in occupational therapy and 27, I think, others in the States were set up in order to rehabilitate the soldiers returning from the war. And one was set up in Toronto, and that's a very important one for the history of occupational therapy in Scotland. So first of all, they were reconstruction therapists. The reconstruction was the word for rehabilitation in the First World War. And all these short courses set up as emergencies to treat these returning soldiers, they all developed after the war into the full occupational therapy courses.
Irene and Tim, could you tell me a little about how the theory behind occupational therapy developed?
Well, I think I've already said something about grading of activities, which was very prevalent within the work within sanitoria, and also in the First World War with patients with physical disabilities where aims of treatment were in relation to muscle strength, dexterity, coordination, stamina, etc. But in the early days when I trained, the theory was very much more implicit than explicit. We sort of learned it by doing and by observation. We didn't really have the vocabulary to express it. We did know some of the theory that was handed down to us through psychology. So we knew about operant conditioning and the importance of positive reinforcement. We knew something about projective techniques that came from Freud's work in working with people with neurosis. But nowadays, of course, with evidence-based practice, occupational therapists are having to develop their own theories, and we have developed frames of reference and approaches and models of practice, so that the modern therapists have a much better ability to articulate the theory behind their work. And we now have a worldwide movement of occupational science, which is looking to develop the evidence and theory base for the profession.
I must say I was very struck in your book, and this is where we're all coming from different backgrounds of clinician and occupational therapist and anthropologist. When you talked, going right back to the early 20th century, about the influence of philosophers and educationalists, people like William James and John Dewey, and how you felt that it seemed as if their ideas were being played out in the way that occupational therapy developed.
Absolutely, learning through doing, Dewey's famous motif, I think it's just as relevant today as it's ever been. And this is how we all learn, through doing. And the use of your bodies in learning is complementary to learning totally academically.
And learning through doing requires repetition. It requires doing it frequently and doing the same thing and building on the same thing that you're doing, just like your graded exercises that you were talking about earlier. And again, that's something that modern occupational therapy doesn't have the luxury of, which raises the question of how do you provide that? And that is a real question, a real difficult problem.
It's a challenge at the moment, isn't it?
But I wanted to come back, Irene, to something you said about the influence of psychoanalysis, the Freud and psychology, because one of the things about shell shock, and that was something that Sir Arthur Hurst was quite keen on, was the fact that these people were actually physically healthy, and it was something in their brain that was inhibiting. It's not to say they were mad or anything like that, but he felt that if you could get over that psychological hurdle, then they could use their physical abilities. And that is echoed now in what is now a diagnosis of functional neurological disorder, where you can find no structural or organic basis for a person's symptoms, which are very real, and you have to use physiotherapy and exercises and inverse commas to persuade them that in fact it's all possible still.
My name is Ray Bartlett. I'm chairman of the Seale-Haynians Alumni Club. Seale-Hayne was built as an agricultural college. It was ready for opening in the end of 1914. It came to the notice of the War Office, and it was used as a military hospital for neurasthenic patients, commonly called shell shock, from April 1918 until about July 1919, only 15 months. Shell shock was a term coined by a senior doctor in the army, Myers, where soldiers had terrible movement disorders, as it was called, hysterical movement disorders, and some of them were struck dumb because of the general trauma of war. They were not all necessarily blown up by shells. Sir Arthur Hurst, the doctor here, was remarkable. He studied up at Oxford, and by chance, in the late 19th century, he studied neurology in Paris with the great French masters, centre of psychiatry in those days. And when the First World War came up, he was a physician, served in Gallipoli, but then because of so many shell shock patients were occurring, he found his way into that sphere. Arthur Hurst's treatment of soldiers, oddly enough, was not that much different from others. It's the way he did it. He cured them by explanation, persuasion, and re-education. He felt it was very, very important to explain to the patients exactly what was not wrong with them and how he was going to treat them, and took them along, got their participation in their own treatment. The important thing to understand, Hurst was not going down the psychological route, what is loosely called PTSD these days. He was treating these psychosomatic movement disorders. His reasoning was that if you could get a man able-bodied again so that he could do a day's work, then he got a chance of leading a life again and coping with any bad dreams he might have.
So how does the practice of craft work in these kinds of cases then? What does it do?
I think it doesn't depend on the condition that
Yes,
you're working with.
That's
very
exactly
much.
the words that I was about to say. It depends on the condition.
Because if you've got a physical condition, then you can tailor your tasks to the disability that they've got, or the sequela of the stroke or the head injury or something like that. So if they've got a weak hand or can't see out of one side of one side, you can tailor the activity to take that into account, but also to encourage them to use use the side that's weak. If they've got what's technically known as cognitive impairments, which means they can't think very straight, or they can't problem solve, then your activities can be in a different way. You can encourage them to see patterns through repetition, to learn what to do.
There's these physical aspects to it, the physical movement, but there's also the psychological aspects to it. Patients who have got these difficulties, they're in a distressed state. They're not happy. They're dealing with loss. And you have to cope with the psychological aspects and some social aspects as well, because the losses are not just personal, they can be within their society and their family. And it's very important that you in some way help them to see a road ahead which is positive. And a piece of craft work that they have produced is a very positive and something they can show people they can do. It's a symbol of hope that not all is lost with this terrible thing that's happening to them.
Hurst was most insistent that any craft, or as it's now called, occupational therapy, a patient should be able to use both hands, both limbs, because if a man had lost the use of one limb because of shell shock, and Hurst cured him, got it moving again, it's important that he should be able to use that arm, and not because he'd got into the habit of using just the other arm and other hand. So it's important that he had an occupation where he could use both hands. Percy Meek was a private soldier. He came from Norfolk, North Norfolk. His parents had a basket making company, and he was a skilled basket maker. He joined up early in the war, had a mild injury, but got over that. He was 23. He was in the trenches in France. One night there was heavy mortar fire, and he got very angry, and he had to be restrained from jumping over the top and taking on the whole German army, saying, "I'll finish that lot." And after the restraint, he became confused, and from there on, over a period of 2 years, I think it was, he went down and down, and it's called regression, and he eventually ended up with the mental age of a child of 1. Percy Meek was first of all treated at Netley, and like so many of them who'd lost their memory, one night suddenly his memory came back. It's quite a common phenomenon. From then they could start to treat him, but he was eventually moved to Seale-Hayne when it opened here, and that's really when his recovery took off. He then very quickly regained all his bodily movements, and he was able to recovered his memory. He could start working with basketry, and he then took over the basket making class, teaching other recovered patients basketry. Percy went back after the war, went back to the family business. We have a copy of a letter that was sent to Arthur Hurst from his parents saying how much better he was and he'd recovered. And he stayed in Snettisham, the family business, and we have a photograph of him in later life, still basket making.
We're talking about one thing, and yet it seems to achieve a lot of different things. And if you understand, so on the one hand it achieves hope, and on the other hand it achieves physiological changes at the same time,
Yes.
which is really interesting.
Absolutely.
But
And it has got social things, because you can give this as a gift
yes,
to someone.
yes,
Say, here, I've made this for you. And that connects them with their family again.
that's great, and that matters as well.
Yes,
that
it
they made
matters.
it,
It's important. Oh.
If we just look at this, which is one of the things that I do with the patients at Regmore, you start by putting these across and putting a stake under that side and weaving it over, under and out on this side. And then you have to put a stake on that side and go over, under and out on that side. So you're alternating right and left. You're having to use right and left hands. You're having to look at the pattern that you're creating. You're working with attention. So it's using the separatedness of the two halves of the brain and making them connect.
And the practice of doing these things is often best done with things that are not familiar, because then there can be no comparison with what you were able to do before your injury and afterwards.
And that's again why basket making is quite good, because people haven't done it.
Can I ask, what made basketry such a popular craft for use in occupational therapy?
Well, it's got a lot of attributes that we require in therapy. It's got its ability to grade, the fact that it's a bilateral activity, that it uses the brain, the fact that it produces useful articles, and it can produce an article quickly. Within a session or two, you've got something that is a finished project. From the complexity of it, it can go from very simple to incredibly complex.
I think the other thing about it is that if you think about the way basketry started as rehabilitation, or it really started as a means of giving people who had disability a job. The blind workshops are a very good example of that.
Absolutely, yes.
And they were producing articles for sale to people who needed baskets. And obviously in the blind field, the St Dunstan's was the charity that did that a lot, and it provided the materials. So that there is that aspect too, and in areas of the world where baskets are still in use, they still use it.
Yeah.
One of the consultants at Regmore came from India, where they were still using basket making until very, very recently.
That would be one explanation.
Yes.
One thing that occurred to me while you were talking, one of the factors that actually the Scottish War Blinded cite as a good reason for people learning basketry is it actually increases sensitivity in the fingers.
Yes.
And so it means that people get better at doing things
Yes.
like then reading Braille. And how about when basketry fell out of use?
Again, that was multiple causes. One, lack of time. Two, the occupational therapists wishing to get rid of their fluffy bunnies and basketry image. It's actually costly in time to do craft work with patients. It needs time with the therapist, not only the time with the patient, but the time in preparation. It needs resources, it needs facilities.
And so do you think the fact that basketry became less relevant, and therefore it just became like a pointless occupation, has anything to do with the rise of the use of the term basket case?
I've been doing a little bit of research into where the term basket case came from. I had always assumed that it was to do with psychiatric patients making baskets in psychiatric hospitals, and that it was a derogatory term to do with someone being mentally ill in some way. But in fact, the internet tells us it comes from American slang, from the First World War, where patients came back, some of them having lost the use of all four limbs through quadriplegia or through amputation. And these people were seen as people in baskets, and therefore basket cases. And I found a photograph of a patient lying in a wicker litter in the 1960s in Scotland.
Right.
So it's very interesting
Yes.
how that has come about.
And certainly the pictures in the Star and Garter Home Archives of rows of patients in wicker bath chairs, wheelchairs.
Yes.
It's now a pejorative term, so I
Yes.
suspect the emphasis is now on the basket making as something you did if you were in a mental asylum.
But
That's the connotation in the public mind
it's
now, I'm
meant,
sure.
it's meant to be something not very nice,
Yeah.
and we should not be using it.
Tim, you've worked in pathology at Raigmore, and now you've been doing work with basketry with patients at Raigmore. I wonder how you got into doing this.
Well, that all started with the Woven Communities Symposium in January this year with a couple of talks.
What type of patients have you been working with?
All sorts of patients with head injury, from whatever cause, be it trauma, stroke, alcohol, post-surgical.
And what have you been doing with the patients?
Well, I've concentrated on doing simple repetitive tasks that exercise the brain and the various parts of the brain, but will also require them to problem solve and actually understand and think about what they're doing.
And what have the outcomes been?
From my point of view, very positive. I've enjoyed it. From their point of view, they're enjoying it too. There's a psychologist who works on the ward, and she says the difference in them is notable. And the other patients on the wards want to take part as well because they see it as being a good thing to do.
Great. So do you think that the hospital will be keen to carry on with this?
I really hope so. They will keep it going for as long as I'm prepared to go in to do it, but I think the bigger challenge is to set up something for the patients to go home to.
So my very last question then is, given the need for meaningful work in occupational therapy, is there any way you can see craft becoming relevant again?
Well, the use of a meaningful activity depends on the culture and depends a lot on fashion. I'm aware that young people are knitting again. There's a proliferation of craft shops throughout the UK, and there's programmes on television now about craft. Making clothes, baking, yes. So these things become relevant again to your population. But also patients or residents in long-term care, and activity organisers will use craft in care homes and with long-term patients with psychiatric problems. But then we have to remember that occupational therapy is no longer confined to the West. It's a worldwide profession now. Something like 72 different countries belong to the World Federation of Occupational Therapists, and in different cultures, basketry will be a big activity, and occupational therapists will therefore use basketry.